Father Sirico is the president and co-founder of the Acton Institute and also the pastor of Sacred Heart of Jesus Parish. Both of those are in Grand Rapids, Michigan. A regular writer and commenter on religious, political, economic, and social issues, Father Sirico's contributions have been carried in a lot of places. Listen to this: the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, the Washington Times, CNN, ABC, CBS, NPR, and the BBC, among others. Notable among his many writings are Catholicism's Developing Social Teaching, A Moral Basis for Liberty, and his newest book, which is available, I am told, for purchase in the back of the room. It's called Defending the Free Market, The Moral Case for a Free Economy. In it, he shows how a free economy is the best way to meet society's material needs and how it best supports the fundamental principle of humanity as being created in the image of God. So please join me in welcoming Father Robert Sirico. There he is. Thank goodness I didn't want to wing that presentation. No, please be here. Nice to see you.
Thank you so much. What a delight to be with you. This is my first visit to South Dakota, and I have to tell you, this was not what I was expecting. I just had this picture of a one-horse buggy town, and here I come and I see this magnificent high school that has won so many awards, even awards from the institute that I'm a part of, that they won awards because of their Catholic identity and their excellence. And to see that hospitality house functioning so well and already, just in a few months, at its capacity, doing things very smartly. And then, of course, to see your newly renovated cathedral, a magnificent piece of work, and so much thought, so much deep thought that went into its restoration. So I'm a real fan. I want you to know that if you need... we have these in Michigan, Pure Michigan commercials. If you need somebody to testify on your behalf, you just give me a call. And it's strange because, even though I live in Michigan, I'm from Brooklyn, New York. So I don't know if you've seen that front cover of the New Yorker magazine from many years ago. It was called A View from New York. I think you can Google it on Google Images. It's hysterical. The perspective is from New York, so you see Fifth Avenue, and you see Central Park, and you see Lincoln Center, and then you see the Hudson River, and then you see Jersey City and Philadelphia, and then it goes out a little further, and there's Chicago, and then there's Seattle, and then there's Los Angeles, and there's San Francisco and Japan, and all the rest of it is empty. Flyover territory. And here we are in the midst of flyover territory. Now, I've lived in Grand Rapids almost 30 years, so I know what it's like to live in our kind of Midwestern communities, and it's a great secret. My brother-in-law, who's from Brooklyn, also had moved to Michigan for a while, and he had settled in a big New York Italian kind of construction worker type guy, and I had arranged for them to get this house, and they moved in with the family and everything, and showed them where they were shopping, and I came over and I said, "How is everything going?" And he said, "It's going good." He says, "But I got a question." I said, "What?" He said, "Like when you're walking down the street and somebody's walking coming opposite direction." I said, "Yeah." He said, "And then they look at you and they say hi?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "What's that about?" And I said, "Lou, don't worry about it." I said, "In this neighborhood, everybody's going to treat you good. Don't worry." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because I told them you're in the witness protection program." No, it is a joy to be with you. And I want to, in this first session, is somebody going to stop me when I go too far? I get till when? What time? You stand up and wave when I have 5 minutes, okay? Good. This first session, I'm going to be with you twice, and this first session is going to be the more abstract session. It's going to be a deep dive into the whys and wherefores of business, and there are going to be points in this you're going to be listening and maybe intrigued by a story. I'm going to try and lace it with lots of little parables and anecdotes and things to concretize what I'm saying, but it's going to be a deep philosophical, theological, anthropological look at enterprise. I hear the snoring already. But that is the grounding for then how to do all of this. And if you don't get that part of it first, it all becomes light and airy and blows away, and you don't know how to get from Sunday to Monday and then from Friday and Saturday to Sunday again, and to permeate our whole lives with this. So then the second one will do a little more practical stuff, but I'll just kind of continue the same theme. As I say, I grew up in Brooklyn in an apartment that was about 4 times the size of this platform that I'm standing on. It looked over Coney Island Avenue. And this is the Brooklyn of the 1950s, not the Brooklyn that you may have in your mind from news reports and stuff. This was a very congenial, multi-ethnic experiment that went on without anybody planning for it to happen. It just kind of happened. If you walked out my front door and made a left-hand turn, you'd come to the hardware shop where there was a Polish plumber and this guy, and then you go down the other corner and there was a kosher pizza parlor down there, and then you go across the street and that's stereotypically enough a Chinese laundry, and it was just this whole jumble of humanity. And for the longest time, with all my Jewish neighbors, I didn't realize that I wasn't Jewish. I knew that our kitchen smelled differently. That was the first clue. And I can still keep a kosher kitchen if I have to now, because so many of my friends were Jewish. And this little apartment overlooked Coney Island Avenue, which wasn't near Coney Island, that was down 2 or 3 miles. And that was my parents' bedroom, which was, keep in mind, this was before the invention of privacy. So there were no doors. You know, it just went right from that bedroom into the living room. My sister slept on the couch in the living room. I had a little crib and then a cot in their bedroom that had to be moved if you wanted to get into the closet. My brothers had this kind of big closet of a room with bunk beds, but that was the dark hole of Calcutta. You know, I kind of look in there, it smelled funny, it was dark, nobody went in. A little bathroom, and then there was this little kitchen, very little kitchen. And the window from our kitchen looked into an apartment directly across that was laid out exactly like ours, but in that apartment there were living Mr. and Mrs. Schneider. It's an older couple, and we'd see them and wave at them, and this was a kind of access, roof access, so you could actually go out your room and go your apartment and go over to the next one and borrow something, which we did periodically. So it was, you know, but she had they had their apartment, we had our apartment. And I remember one day, it was a spring day, it was beautiful, the windows were open, and Mrs. Schneider was standing there and she was rolling something out on her kitchen table. Turns out these are called rucola. Rucola is a wonderful kind of Danish, a little pastry, very flaky, and she's mixing in a bowl the walnuts and raisins and cinnamon and sugar and butter that goes into the stuffing of the rucola. And then she's cutting these croissants. You would roll them up, but they were little triangles, and she'd dollop some of this mixture and she'd roll it all up and put it on the cookie sheet and put it into this pale green Wedgwood oven, and then go to work again. And I'm just standing there watching this whole thing going on. And pretty soon I'm mesmerized by the motions. She pulls the cookies out, she puts more cookies in, and she pulls them out and puts them in. 3 or 4 or 5 times she does this. And of course now I'm wafting across from her window to my window is this great, succulent aroma. And I'm completely in ecstasy of this whole thing. And she didn't say a word, she didn't acknowledge my presence until she pulled out the last cookie sheet. And she put it on the windowsill, and she looked up and looked directly into my eyes, and she said, "You'll come, I'll give you to eat." And so I scampered over the windowsill, and I went up and held out my greedy little hands, and she put a napkin over my hands and proceeded to place these warm, luscious rucola on my napkin. And as she did so, I noticed running up her forearm were a series of blue tattooed numbers. And I had no clue what that meant. And frankly, I was more interested in these delicious delectables that were given to me. And I went back into the kitchen and I immediately hid them from my siblings because the Siricos raised no stupid children. And my mom came in. I said, Mrs. Schneider gave me some of the rugula. And she said, good, good. And I said, why does Mrs. Schneider have this tattoo on her arm? Now, I'm telling you this story to confirm that a knowledge of the truth, and sometimes the most profound and most fundamental truths, is not something we necessarily acquire by book learning. It's something we know in nature. If we know nature, we know the truth of things, and then all we have to do is kind of build on that truth of things. And so my mother sat down with me, and she gave me what was the most profound course on philosophy, on morality, that I think I had ever had, and it was done in the simplest way possible. She said, you know how when you watch the cowboys and the ranchers on television on Saturday mornings, we'd watch all the cowboy shows, you know, probably filmed around here. And I said, yeah. And she said, now, when they lasso a calf, what does the cowboy do? I said, well, they lasso the calf, and they turn it upside down, and they tie it tight. And she said, and then what do they do? I said, then they bring over a brand, and they brand the calf. And she said, and why do they do that? I said, so that lets everybody know that that's that cowboy's calf and nobody else's. She said, that's what they did to Mr. and Mrs. Schneider. That's what the tattoo is. She really didn't need to say any more about that because I was horrified. Now think of that, a 5-year-old being horrified at a human being not being treated as a human being. I knew the distinction between animals and human beings. I knew something about the intrinsic dignity of all human life. She said, that's why Mr. and Mrs. Schneider came to our country. I knew they spoke with a foreign accent, and I knew they spoke different words, you know, Yiddish words. I used to think that the word mashugana, which is Yiddish for crazy, was Italian, you know. You get confused, you're growing up, you don't know these things. And she said, that's why you have to treat them with particular respect, because they lost their whole family that way, because some people came to power and treated them and people like them because of their religion, treated them like they were animals. And that set my mind to thinking about life. And I began to see things that were happening in my world. This is the 1950s and then into the 1960s. I began to see things that were happening in my world through the lens of what I knew about human dignity. My mother didn't use the word human dignity. I didn't use it. I wouldn't have known what that meant. But that's what it was. That's what I was grappling with, even without the vocabulary. I knew something innately. I would need help later on to put words to concepts, and then how to link these concepts with other concepts in order to build a philosophy of life. But the important thing is that I learned how to think about a truth that was right present to me in my life. And so that as I continued to grow and began to hear reports about I remember these vague reports about what was going on in Cuba and being horrified by that. It just seemed like there's something terribly wrong going on there. Or the communists in China, there seemed something terribly wrong about that. And then to see, more particularly, the beginnings of the civil rights movement unfold before my eyes and be bewildered as to why somebody in the South would object to kids who were black eating at a Woolworth's lunch counter with them when I would go to Woolworth's and eat at a lunch counter with black kids or for that matter, be served by a black waitress, and didn't think twice about it. I mean, now mind you, my family was not a politically correct family at all. My father is the original Archie Bunker. I'm sure that they patterned that on him. But somehow it was all bravado. It wasn't a deep hatred of people. Maybe it was not being acquainted with different ethnic groups and their ways and customs. But to say you couldn't eat at a counter, and so I watched these events, these historic events unfolding, and read it through the lens of that experience with Mrs. Schneider years before. Well, there are a lot of anecdotes that I could relate about growing up, but let me suffice it to say that by the time the anti-war movement came around, and now this is in the late 60s and the early 1970s, and all of the other social change movements that began to hit our country right about the year 1968 into the early 70s, I was completely confused about what justice meant and how to work for justice. I knew that I wanted to reach out to the marginalized. There was some moral sense of that. My family was a very culturally Catholic family, but not a particularly devout Catholic family. I think the first time I saw my whole family at Mass together was at my ordination. It was that kind of thing. But in the 60s and 70s, what began to replace religious fervor in my heart was political fervor in the name of justice. And I found myself doing what a lot of people in that period did. I was involved heavily with the political left. By this time now, I had gone to California. I had friends in California, and we were involved in every political change movement you could imagine. On a given day, I would be at 3 or 4 different picket lines. This kind of became my life. I would get a job just enough to have a little bit of money to keep body and soul together, but our passion was to bring about the revolution. And we spoke of that in very serious terms. It was an amazing period of time. I drank the Kool-Aid. Thank God I survived, because some of those people never survived. And I remember one day I was in an apartment, a bunch of friends, we had been at some demonstrations. We were sitting around in the apartment, people were on the floor, and we were talking about the revolution when it comes out. We're talking about the tail end of the anti-war movement, the farm workers movement, the beginnings of the gay movement, the beginnings of the feminist movement, all of these various movements working toward some revolutionary change that we wanted to bring about, but at least for me, very unclear programmatically about what we wanted to bring about. If you asked me at the time, what did I want? I wanted to see a redistribution of wealth. Wealth somehow was evil. Profit was evil. And as we were sitting there talking with friends, everybody was going around, when the revolution comes, I want to see this. When the revolution comes, we'll be able to do that. And my turn came, and I said, when the revolution comes, we'll all be able to shop at Gucci's. And the smoke stood still in the room. I won't tell you what kind of smoke it was. I'll be honest enough to say that I did inhale. And I'm looking over at my friend, and they're all just horrified. Gucci's. And I'm trying to think, what's the matter with Gucci's? They said, Gucci's is a symbol, it's a metaphor for people being able to have access to goods and services of quality. So if we're all able to shop at Gucci's, it means that the world has become wealthier. That's what I mean by that. And this friend of mine, her name was Anne, she looked up at me, and she kind of plopped her head on my shoulder. She said, Robert, you're not a real socialist. You're bourgeois. Gucci's? And she was right. I was wrong. I was not a socialist. I went under that banner, the kind of New Left banner, because it seemed to me, the appeal of it was to me, and I think to a lot of people very sincerely, is that it reaches out in the name of justice for people, to the marginalized, to the poor. Even some in our church can make that mistake and do make that mistake. So as I thought about that, and it was a gift from a friend who is completely opposed to everything that I believe in today. Fortunately enough, I met somebody We had a big argument over politics and economics, and now I'm away from my church, my faith completely. And he gives me these books to read on economics. I begin reading these books on economics by Friedrich Hayek, The Road to Serfdom, a little book called The Law by Friedrich Bastiat, or some other penetrating books like Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom, or Ludwig von Mises' Socialism, these heavy tomes. I began to read. And it was as though the dimmer in the room began to go up to illuminate the room, because now, as I walked around the room and would bump into things, I could make out their shapes much better than I could at that time. One example, and this will come as a very simple economic mistake to most of you who are in business, but to me, in my early 20s, it was a real revelation. So this guy I'm arguing with, he says, you want to redistribute the wealth of all the world? I said, yes. He said, okay, let's do a little mind experiment. Poof. You have redistributed the wealth in all the world. Now what? You know, when I was writing this book, Defending the Free Market, I did a little calculation, a very simple calculation on what is the wealth of the whole world, and I divided the number of people in the world into that number. And when you come out, it means that everyone would have about $13,000. Now, for some of you, that's going to be a real pay cut. But some people in the world, that is going to be all they would have ever hoped to have made in 3 lifetimes. So it would readjust. So he continued this mental experiment with me, and he said, so now you have redistributed the wealth of the world. Is everything just now? I said, yes. He said, okay, now the next day, the 3rd day, what do people do on the 3rd day? And I said, what do you mean, what do they do? I said, what are they going to do? I said, well, people go to work. And he said, where are they going to work? I said, well, the businesses. He said, no, there are no businesses. You have redistributed all of the wealth of the world. Where do you think most of the wealth is invested? I had never thought about that. He said, you seem to think that people who are wealthy have the majority of their holdings in their rings and in their coats and in their boats and in their houses. He said, that's a fraction of the wealth of the really wealthy. He said, the majority of their money is invested, which means it's employing people. It's in businesses, it's in capital. Didn't know what that meant. That's why Marx was so anti-capital. You know, a capital good is different than a consumptive good. A consumption good. A consumption good is something you can use now. Capital good is something you build in order to produce consumption goods, right? So if the fish is the consumption good, the net is the capital good. It's what you make business with. And it was like a whole new world. The world of wealth, the world of material prosperity, is not a static pie in need of just being divided up in order to solve the problem of maldistribution. It is not something that stays static, it's something that grows. And when it grows, it doesn't mean that a person gets less because somebody has more. It may be that somebody has a lot more. But the whole question of equality and inequality, it seems to me, is not the key moral question to be asking. I don't care what the wealth gap is between Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. Is that unjust? That Bill Gates owns multiples of what Warren Buffett does? It's not the gap. And it's not the ceiling, because if Bill Gates is earning his money legitimately by providing us with the means of technology and communications and all of the rest of it, and he's not doing it by exploiting people, he's not doing it by robbing people, not doing it by enslaving people, he's doing it because he's rendering a service to people, and so many people buy his goods and services that he becomes wealthy on the products that are sold voluntarily. I don't care about the ceiling. I don't care about the ceiling. I don't care about the gap. I care about the floor. I care about how the most vulnerable people are doing. And what we do know is that societies that allow people to be creative and that don't punish in one way or another their creativity, that allow them a maximum amount of freedom within the rule of law, of course, and this is what the Holy Fathers have emphasized over and over again, that any economic system has to be grounded in an ethical framework. It has to rest on ethical foundations, that when you have this, then you can have a society that slowly becomes prosperous. And this is why it's so important that the ethical framework be there. Because anyone who worships money, anyone who believes in just the absolute right of money, is worshiping something not only that is false, but something that is beneath them. Materialism, consumerism isn't evil because you're dealing with material things. It's evil because it's beneath us. Because Mr. and Mrs. Schneider had a value intrinsic to them. Their dignity did not depend on any society in which they lived. It did not depend on the laws that were made. Their dignity, their rights did not depend on their family or their communities. Their dignity, their rights were the result of their existence. Because they were human beings. Because we are human beings, no matter our ethnicity, our vulnerability, our stage of development, each human life possesses an infinite dignity, an unrepeatable dignity that is unique to that person. And part of that dignity is played out in what I came to understand as business. And business is premised on the right to private property. Now, this was another of these big questions that I thought was so enormous, so impenetrable. And here's what I learned. Rightly understood, what private property is not the right to own a material object in itself. That's not even secondary, tertiary. The first and foremost reason that private property is just, in fact, in Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo XIII calls it sacred. Not absolute, but sacred nonetheless. You have to really have a very good reason to expropriate someone's property. You can't just do it willy-nilly because you go, it's going to be better to do it this way. The reason that private property is sacred is because of its proximity to the human person. It derives its sacral character from the dignity of the human person in this way. Private property comes into existence by a human being seeing something that other people haven't seen, or doing something that no one else has done. Deriving from nature something that was of no use to anybody, and fashioning it in some way so as to draw out from nature this object that this person now can rightly call his or her own. Private property comes as the result of what we would call today an entrepreneurial insight, some kind of way of seeing something that lay undiscovered, whether it's a process or a resource. Here's an illustration of what I mean, to kind of bring it down from the abstract. For most of human history, oil existed under the plains of the desert, and if people saw it or came upon it, it was usually an annoyance. But until the combustion engine was designed by human intelligence, creativity, entrepreneurship, until a way could be created whereby that petroleum was transformed into energy, oil had no value. Value is brought to it not because the value existed in resources. People talk about natural resources as making a nation rich. It's not true. If natural resources makes a nation rich, then Africa would be rich. The whole continent would be rich, and Japan would be poor. What's the difference? Japan has no natural resources to speak of. Now they're even importing rice. Africa has all these natural resources, and they're poor. There are reasons, there are institutional reasons, and a lot of those reasons have to do with the right to acquire property, own it, invest it, trade it, and create more wealth. Now, this is a very powerful engine in a society, so powerful that like a scalpel, it can be wielded to save a life or to destroy a life. And this is why the popes have been so consistent in emphasizing the moral imperative to utilize resources, property, money, wealth, for the common good. The question is, how do we place these things at the disposal of the common good? And that's where markets come in. This is where you come in. The way in which the funding of the petroleum industry began to take place was that people began to invent other kinds of mechanisms around petroleum, automobiles and the like, that began to be placed at human service, and people began to value that service, and they began to trade, and then whole industries would creep up or build up around all of that. You see, this is essentially, or must be seen essentially, as a human engagement, that the human person must remain at the center of economics. Economics, in one sense, the way we usually think about this, we call it the dismal science. It's usually seen as an abstraction, just a bunch of numbers, just a bunch of equations. But I want you to think about economics in a much more profound way, in a much more anthropological way. What if you thought about economics as human action? No economic activity would occur were it not for human beings acting to satisfy some want in their lives. And our wants are insatiable. Our wants are infinite. And that, by the way, is the reason that markets can never satiate us. That is the reason that products can never ultimately satiate us, because we are eternal beings. So the trick for people in business is to begin with this anthropological understanding that while it's great if you have a reliable car, a stylish bit of clothing, or a reliable watch, or whatever it happens to be, a comfortable house, while all of that is fine and important, if you see that as the end of your existence, or to use the phrase that Pope Francis has used over and over again, if you see that as the object of your worship, then you will be forever miserable. Because no matter how beautiful the house, no matter how accurate the timepiece, no matter how fashionable the dress, it is only a means. It is of this earth. You are infinite. So to fill us and satiate us, we have to find that wellspring of water that comes up and that will never run dry. Now, all of this is to say something profoundly critical for everyone to understand. I think a great moment was lost for about 40 years, and we may be just recovering from it, when at the Second Vatican Council, the document on the laity was issued. That document on the laity really came as a result of a lot of theological meditation that went back a decade before its promulgation in 1965. One of the key council fathers was named Yves Congar, a Dominican, and he had a whole big, beautiful book on the laity. And he says some very interesting things about work in that book. You know, right after the council, there was a lot of talk about the role of the laity in the church. And what did that mean? How did that translate itself concretely? Well, all of a sudden we had lay lectors. We had never had lay lectors before. or very rarely had lay lectors. Then we had lay extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion. And you remember, I don't see it so much anymore, but I remember in the days they would have medallions that they would wear, or even albs that they would wear, and they would come up around the altar and at the consecration, and the priest would distribute. And so the notion in those days was that the role of the lay people was being fulfilled by proximity to the altar, by proximity to the priest. Now, that was all nice and good, and everybody had a lot of fun doing that. But that's a mistaken, if not mistaken, at least an anemic understanding of what this document is saying on the role of the laity in the church. And the role of the laity in the church goes back to this anthropological reality that I was talking about earlier. The God who creates the heavens and the earth pronounces the world good, right? And then the first words he speaks to the newly created human family, whom, by the way, he has fashioned from the dust of the earth and breathes into him the breath of life. So the human being, the human person, is a combination of the physical and the transcendent. What are the first words God says to the newly created human family? Be like me. Multiply. Fill the earth. Because we're seeing this God fashioning things, creating things, drawing things into existence from nothing. And God says, you're created in my image, in my likeness. And this is what the document on the laity is really going back to. A deep understanding of the nature of the lay apostolate in the church, which in the paragraph 4, and in fact I found it written on one of the mission cards for the Catholic Men's Business Fraternity, we are called by God to exercise our apostolate as leaven in the world. How does leaven work in bread? You knead the dough, right? And you insinuate the leaven into the dough. You don't just paint it over the outside of the loaf. You work it in and through. You want it permeating every facet of the loaf. Then you let it form. And that's how the leaven affects the loaf. This is the primary and fundamental call of the layperson in the apostolate of the church. You receive the leavening by your baptism, by the sacraments, by the needed formation that you're offered, by the catechists and the teachers of the church, which include you, by the way. You receive that formation, that first leavening, in places like this, and in other places before the tabernacle and in the quiet of a chapel somewhere, where Christ is gestating in your soul. But then you don't just bring that back to church. You carry that with you into the business place. You know, one of the most frustrating things that I have seen in my work, both as a priest, but also as somebody who has responsibility to raise money, because you don't run a thing like the Acton Institute. You don't run a parish. You don't run a school without having to appeal to people for money. But the most frustrating thing I see, and I know that you have experienced it, is that when people come to you, whether they're pastors or fundraisers, and they just see you with dollar signs. Like, that's your main role. Your role, and this is like the second level of development of the understanding of the lay apostolate, right? This is also anemic, it's also mistaken, but this is a little bit better than thinking you're really exercising your lay vocation by being little priests. By the way, I'm not against special ministers of Holy Communion, extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion or lectors in their appropriate place, the appropriate time. That's not my point about that. My point is to look deeper. But the second level is, oh yes, it's your work to go out and make money and bring it to me so that we can spend it on all these wonderful projects. And we need somebody to be doing that. That's absolutely true. There's a deeper level that is your vocation, your apostolate. And that is to take this leavening I've just talked about and bring it with you into your workplace and begin the transformation of that workplace whatever it happens to be, whatever kind of work you happen to be doing, to bring to bear on that workplace your relationship with Jesus Christ. So your contribution to the church's mission is not just the superfluous money that you make that you donate back to the church. As important as that is, please tell the bishop I said that. As important as that is, your first and foremost vocation is to be faithful to Christ in your workplace. Here's what Yves Congar, remember this is one of the fathers of the Second Vatican Council and probably the ghostwriter of much of that document on the laity, the Second Vatican Council. Here's how he put it. He said, we are called not to Christianize our workplace. We're not called to Christianize our workplace. We bring our rosary beads and we put it in the workplace. We hope somebody will ask us about it. Maybe we have our missal or our Bible or our Magnificat visible. We invite people to church or to a soup kitchen or, whatever, and that's Christianizing our workplace. Maybe we set a high ethical standard in the workplace. That's Christianizing the workplace. That's like putting decorations around it that are intrinsically alien to it. And what Congar said is we're not called to Christianize our workplace. We're called to Christo-finalize it. That is, to bring the very purpose of work to its finality, to its end, to its telos in Christ. Work is a call from God. It's a vocation from God that takes place before sin enters into the world. Now it is broken like everything else in creation is broken after sin, because that's when work then becomes toil. But work itself is a noble vocation. And to Christo-finalize our work is to really be putting the leaven in the loaf. Because then people are caught into a certain orbit, a certain momentum that brings them along. And in that momentum, in that context, grace is being offered. You remember the poet Jared Manley Hopkins, wonderful Victorian poet, the Jesuit. He wrote a poem called God's Grandeur. And the one line of it that I remember, it starts out, the world is charged. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will shake forth like shining from shook foil. You imagine that? You see that as I do that on this? You see the little lights that are coming out of that? Imagine that tin foil. I'm doing that. He's saying that the world is so charged with the grandeur of God that you see God in the whole world. It shines forth it breaks forth like shining from shook foil. Every place in the world, even in the material world, contains the offer of relationship with God, grace. That's what grace is. The offer of relationship with God. So when you touch the world through a business, through an enterprise that is governed by your formation as a disciple of Jesus Christ, when you Christo-finalize your workplace, you are making that offer of grace available. And for some it'll come in one way, and another it'll come in another way, but God is there operating in and through the enterprise that you've created. So in a way, it's superficial to just talk about profits. Profits are important because if you don't make profits, come on. It's very easy not to make a profit, right? Wealth is the exceptional state of reality. If you want to not make a profit, sit here long enough. It's called poverty. No, wealth is the exception. You have to do something. And to do it as a disciple of Christ, to do it with the kind of understanding that I've been trying to reflect on with you here, is really what it means to be engaged in the apostolate of the church. This is the church's work in the world. A young man, and I'm going to stop in just a moment. I'm about getting there, am I? Yeah. Young man went into a monastery and he wrote home to his father after he'd been there a little while, and he said, "Dad, Mom, I found my vocation." It's just incredible. We get up in the middle of the night when all the world is hushed to pray the divine office, to sing the chants, the psalms. I'm so glad I'm away from the world and that I've discovered my vocation. And his father, who's a very wise man, wrote back and said, "Dear son, your mother and I are so delighted that you found your vocation in the monastery. But there is one thing I want to remind you of. Many a night your mother and I would wake up from our beds when all the world was hushed to change your dirty diapers. And in that, we found our vocations." Isn't that wonderful to think of a baby's diaper as the discovery of your vocation? The mess of a diaper. But is it any different than the mess of a garage, or the mess of an accounting firm, or the mess of, you tell me, of all of the different places that we exist, that you exist in business? If Jesus Christ is Emmanuel, if Jesus Christ is God with us, then he must be God with us on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. He must be God with us in every shop and in every place that work and enterprise goes on, or else he is no Emmanuel. So when our Lord entrusted those talents to those servants in that beautiful parable of Matthew, he was telling them to be effective with the talents, to be creative, to even risk with those talents, because that's the only way they could become a servant. And I just want you to know that as you engage in your various enterprises and hopefully are successful in what you do, that it bothers me that some people call into question the seriousness of your discipleship with Christ precisely because of your success. That's such a mistaken notion, an incoherent notion. I pray that as you try to be Christ's faithful disciples and be productive with the talents that he has entrusted you with, that you will be generous with those talents. And by that I mean don't just mean giving them away in charity. Of course we do that. But be generous in helping others to learn that technique of human creativity, of other regardingness, as you anticipate what people's needs are in markets, because that's what you do, that's what enterprise does. I pray that you'll be faithful to your vocation, and that on the last day, when we all stand before that great seat of judgment, where all of the wrongs of the world will finally be made right, that you will hear the voice of the Master say to you then, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Thou hast proven thyself faithful in small things. Now enter into thy Master's joy." Thank you very much.